Hey guys, welcome to your very first video of e-learning now that we're all basically quarantined from the coronavirus. So here's your 9A notes. My screen recorder can only do 15 minutes at a time, so I'm going to go kind of fast. If you're watching it on YouTube, you do have the ability to slow down the speed if you need to. But with all of your notes, I'm going to do them on the OneNote. They'll all be filled out. You guys just copy them down onto some paper and then upload a picture of them to your OneNote so that I can see them. You can try and write on your screen with your finger. It doesn't always work the best, but kind of do it however you want to do it. So target 9A. So we have a bit of review from KC3. So for an arithmetic sequence, it was when we had a common difference. Right, where A1 was your first number and D was the common difference. So if we look at our first example, right, you see we have this sequence here, 3, 7, 11, 15, 23. A1 is always the first number. So A1 is 3. And then it asks you what the common difference is. The common difference is how much is changing by. So if you look each time, it's going up by a positive 4. Right, so with KC9, we're going to be looking at something similar, but with this time, it's not going to have a common difference. We're looking at a common ratio. So here's your formula. So you have AN equals A1, parentheses R to the N minus 1. So that's your general formula, and you're pretty much just plugging in numbers for A1 and numbers for R. So those are the only two things you're going to be putting numbers in. A1 is still the first number in the sequence, and then R becomes your common ratio. So let's look at our first example. So we have the sequence. So it's 3, 6, 12, 24, 48, 96. So the difference between this one is when you have a common ratio, this is looking at multiplying and dividing. So you're not adding and subtracting each time, you're multiplying and dividing between your numbers each time. So looking at the sequence, right, as for A1, just like before, A1 is always your first number, so it's 3. But then to find the common ratio, we have to look at how much our numbers are changing by, or how we get from one number to the next number. So if you look, we're multiplying by 2 each time, so your common ratio is 2. And then it asks you to write the explicit formula. So the explicit formula, the AN is always the same. Then instead of A1, we're putting the number 3 because that was our first number. Instead of the common ratio, we're inputting 2 because that was our common ratio. And then to the N minus 1, that is an N. Right, so now we're going to do a couple examples where it asks us to find the common ratio and then write the explicit formula. So the two things we need are A1 and R for all of our formulas. So A1 is the first number, so A1 is 2. Then R looks for the common ratio, so what your numbers are changing by. So each time you can see we are multiplying by 4. So our common ratio is 4. So our formula is going to be AN equals 2 times 4 to the N minus 1. Right? Next example. So with this one, our A1 is negative 80. And then we have to look for our common ratio. So with this one, let me see. We are dividing by 4 each time. So when you're dividing by 4, we use the common ratio 1/4, right? If you make it a fraction, that shows that you're doing division. So now when we go through and make our formula, our first number is negative 80, and in order to show that we're doing division each time, we use it in the fraction form, so 1/4. All right, next one, our A1 is the first number, so our first number is negative 3, and then our common ratio is what's happening. So each time we are multiplying by 4. So that tells us our common ratio is 4. So we're doing an equals -3 times 4 to the n minus 1. Right, so this is pretty simple. We're just, and then last one, right, you can kind of see, I know it has decimals, okay, so A1 is 0.45, and then for your common ratio, if you look, you can actually see that things are multiplying by 2 each time. So your common ratio is 2. So your formula, you do your A1, then in parentheses you put your common ratio, and then to the n minus 1, boom. Alright, so next one, it says from each table write the explicit rule. So I gave you your formula that you need. You're just taking each table and then putting it into the rule. So you need your A1 and then your R and n minus 1. So we can see each time we're multiplying by 4, right? Your A1 is the first number, so it's 3. So when you write your rule, we're doing an equals 3, and in parentheses you're doing 4 to the n minus 1. Right, next one, we're going up by we're multiplying by 1.5 each time, and 2 is your A1. So you're doing 2 for your A1, 1.5 for your common ratio, n minus 1. Done. And then for this last one, we're actually dividing by 3 each time. And then your A1 is 135. So when we go to write this one, your A1 is 135, but since we're dividing each time by 3, you want to make sure you're putting it as the fraction 1/3, so you know the difference between multiplication and division. So when you have the fraction, it's division. When you have just like the 4 here, that's multiplication. But as soon as you put it into a fraction, that shows that you're doing division each time. All right, next one we have write an explicit rule that represents a geometric sequence that has an initial value of 50. So initial value of 50, that's telling you your A1, and then it says a common ratio of 3. So that tells you your R. So that tells you that your A1 is 50 and that your common ratio is 3. So then you just go in and fill it into your formula. Boom. Done. Right? And then your next one, it's an explicit rule, represents a geometric sequence, initial value of 80, and then common ratio of 1/2. So your A1 is 80 and your common ratio is 1/2, right? Which means each time you're dividing by 2. So if you start with 80, your next number would be 40. The number after that would be, right, you'd start with 80, your next number would be 40, then 20, then 10, right? Because you're dividing by 2 each time, right? Your ratio is 1/2. So you're writing the formula, we started with 80, and then each time we're doing 1/2, or we're dividing by 2. One last one, just like this. So with this one, you have an initial value of 240, common ratio of 0.2. Oh, that says ration, it should say ratio. So 240 initial, and then common ratio of 0.2. Your common ratio can be a fraction, that's okay. Right, so you're basically just filling in, your A1 goes here, and your common ratio goes inside the parentheses, right? All right, next one. So it says given the recursive formula, you have to write the explicit formula. So you're given the recursive formula is an equals an minus 1 times 3, and the fourth term is 54, right? So this times 3, that tells us that your common, when it says times 3 over there, that tells you that your common ratio is 3. And then it gave you the fourth term for this one. So if we were going to kind of write it out, we would know we have the first number, the second number, the third number, and then the fourth number. So you know it tells you the fourth number is 54. So we're going to fill in that the fourth number is 54. You have to figure out a 1 in order to write your sequence. So to do that, you know that the common ratio is 3. So you know that each time you are going to be multiplying by 3. So in order to get back to the original one, we're going to kind of do it backwards and divide by 3 each time until we get back to our original one. So we're going to do 54 divided by 3 to get to the next one, which is 18. And then we would divide by 3 again to get the next one, so 6, and then divide by 3 again to get our A1, which is 2. So now we have our common ratio and our A1, right? If we look at it, we figured out our A1 is 2 and our common ratio is 3, which we found out from the recursive. So we just fill this in and write our formula. So AN equals 2, common ratio of 3 to the n minus 1. So with this one, it's going to tell you which term you have. So if it tells you you have the fourth term, right, that means you kind of have spot number 4. And you have to go back and figure out the other ones from there. All right, and this is our last one for our notes. So the amount of bacteria quadruples every day. So when it says quadruples, that tells you we are multiplying by 4 each time. So that tells you R equals 4. On the first day, you count the number of bacteria in the Petri dish and record the number as 200. So that tells you that your A1 is 200. Determine the explicit rule that will allow you to project the number of bacteria, then use that rule to calculate the projected number of bacteria on the 7th day. So 2-part question. So first part, we have to write the formula. So our formula is going to be AN equals 200 times 4 to the n minus 1, right? Because 200 is our A1, which we found, and then our common ratio was 4 because we found that from the quadruples. So when it says on the 7th day, that means we need to figure out the number when n equals, let me zoom this in so I can write a little bit neater, figuring out when n equals 7. So you're going to go in, right? So for the second part, we're figuring out when n equals 7. So we should have A7 equals 200 times 4 to the 7 minus 1. So wherever you saw an n before, you're plugging in a 7. So we have an n over here and an n up here. So anywhere you see an n, you're plugging in 7. So this means when you go through, we're actually doing 200 times 4 to the 6th power, and you always do the exponent first. So we figure out what 4 to the 6th power is. Let me figure out what that is really quick. 4 to the 6th power, which is 4,096. And then we multiply that by 200. So the answer we should get is 819,200. All right, so make sure you go through and you have all of this copied onto a piece of paper, and you can upload it to your OneNote, or if you want to try writing it with your finger, you can. So this is all the notes for the first day. Tomorrow you're going to do some practice on it and also upload a picture of that practice onto your OneNote. Everything I have is uploaded, so if you just click on the OneNote, you'll see the practice for tomorrow and then these notes you'll have for today. Awesome job. Thanks for tuning in. Love y'all. Bye.